We're in the process of explaining our individual votes. I've already announced to the media priorly that I was going to vote in favor of obedience to the TRO for the following grounds. Now I will try to summarize them very quickly. Under law, there is such a thing as a last clear chance doctrine. If both parties are at fault, perhaps in an automobile collision, but one party had the last clear chance to avoid the collision but did not take that chance, then he is the one who is at fault. Today, we have a TRO issued by the Supreme Court against the impeachment court. The Supreme Court is what its name implies, the Supreme Court. This, by contrast, is just the High Court of impeachment. If we do not obey the TRO, then we are engaged in a collision course. And it is now for the Senate to avail of the last clear chance to avoid a collision, which will naturally result in a constitutional collision. That is the first argument. The second argument is this. Under the 1987 Constitution, the Supreme Court is vested with judicial power. There are two components of judicial power. One is the power to decide justiciable issues. Two, another component peculiar only to the Philippine Constitution is that the Supreme Court has power over political questions. In that manner, therefore, the 1987 Constitution has already abolished the political question doctrine, which is still observed in other democracies like ours, particularly in the United States. So, if that is the case, then the Supreme Court has a more comprehensive extent of judicial power than that possessed by the United States Supreme Court because of this constitutional provision. The case of Nixon versus United States involved a federal judge who, under American law, is authorized to be impeached by the Senate. Here we don't have that system. Therefore, the ruling in U.S. versus Nixon does not apply to the Philippine jurisdiction. It is, of course, a valid decision to be cited in American law, but not in Philippine law, because of our constitutional provision is markedly different. Third ground, the secrecy of foreign currency deposits law is a child of this Congress. We passed that law and said the secrecy of foreign currency deposits is absolute except and only except when the depositor himself gives his consent. We made that condition sole, alone, and by itself. We made that law. Now are we going to break that law? Lawmakers cannot be lawbreakers. Fourth ground, the theory of checks and balances prohibits this impeachment court from claiming an exception unto itself. Under the theory of separation of powers, there are three branches of our government, as enumerated in our Constitution. There is no specific provision in the Constitution that our governmental system is divided into three branches, but you can imply it from the fact that there are three separate and successive articles in our Constitution headed with the titles, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and then the judicial branch. So by implication, we imply that our government has three branches. Now, under the system of checks and balances of a tripartite system of government, each branch has power to check or to modify the actions of other branches. That is the system of checks and balances. Even the Supreme Court is not final in its decisions. This Congress, for example, can go against the grain of a Supreme Court decision and in that way overrule or overturn the decision of the Supreme Court. Who are we that we should claim an exemption from the principle of checks and balances which underlies the very system of government under which we operate? Who are we? Is the impeachment court illimitable? Are the powers of the impeachment court infinite? Are we almighty above all the three other branches of government? We are not even mentioned in a separate article. We are the impeachment court mentioned only under the article concerning accountability of public officers. So if we do not recognize Supreme Court, who therefore do we recognize? Nobody? Nobody's checking the impeachment court? Is that your theory? Fifth ground, disobedience to the TRO violates the defendant's human rights. The separation of powers doctrine was invented to protect the individual rights the individual and his rights, or in other words, his human rights. So, it becomes a question of how much judicial review should the Supreme Court exercise over the impeachment court. I humbly submit that it should not be full judicial review, that it can check us at any point. Those are the nightmares of someone who is not educated in the democratic process. I humbly submit that the Supreme Court has the power to exercise the most minimum judicial review. Who decides what is the most minimum judicial review? The impeachment court. Finally, sixth ground. In at least 2 previous cases, the Supreme Court has already ruled that it has power of judicial review over impeachment cases. These are the 2 cases of Francisco V. Nagmamalasakit, decided in 2003, and this very new case of Gutierrez versus House of Representatives. If that is the case, then we follow judicial precedent. It is already a standing rule in law. Thank you.
Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Jinggoy Estudo Estrada wishes to be recognized.
Mr. President. The gentleman from San Juan and President pro tempore of the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I voted to uphold the TRO of the Supreme Court. Mr. President, my family has been a victim of the past administration for not upholding the rule of law in so many instances, in various instances, Mr. President. Even the Supreme Court created a special court designed solely to convict former President Estrada. But, Mr. President, we have always respected and abided by the decision of the court, whether it is adverse or not. Mr. President, I am considered to be an ally of President Aquino. We have been very supportive of his projects. But my primary concern here is the welfare of the administration of President Aquino. Can our country afford a constitutional crisis? Can our country afford political instability? Can our country afford a clash between the legislative and the judiciary? Mr. President, my answer is no. We want to see President Aquino succeed in his dreams for our country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Majority Floor Leader.
Senator Chief Escudero, finally, Mr. President.
The gentleman from Sorsogon has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I voted with the majority to issue the subpoena insofar as the bank records are concerned, both local and foreign. I still stand by that decision, Mr. President. I believe the TRO issued by the Supreme Court is wrong. However, the place to slug it out is not here, but in the Supreme Court. Hindi naman tayo mga tambay sakali na pwede tayo magpatigasan ng muka dahil hindi tayo nagkakasundo. Ang tamang lugar para ipaglaban na tayo tama ay sa Korte Suprema na siyang nag-issue ng desisyon. Hindi po dito para pagbanggain ang dalawang institusyon ng ating pamahalan. Mr. President, I am saddened by the fact that we even had to put this to a vote. Labi sa aking kalukutan na kailangan pa bang pagbotohan ito? Ang katanungang, susundin ba natin ang desisyon ng Korte o hindi? Natatakot na nanganganib na baka mamaya gayahin tayo ng ibang mga sanggunian sa buong bansa. Paano nalaman ko ang sanggunian panlalawigan, bayan o syudad ng ibang probinsya, munisipyo at syudad? Sabihin, tingin namin mali ang desisyon ng Korte. Pagbotohan nga natin kung susunod tayo o hindi. Dahil mali yan illegal yan. As a student of the law, Mr. President, tama man o mali ang desisyon, tinuruan po kami na sumunod at ipaglaban na lamang ang aming karapatan sa loob ng Korte. Hindi sumuway. Dahil ang kapalit po niyan, anarkiya sa ating bansa at karapatan at kapangyarihan para sa bawat isa sa atin. Piliin alin ang desisyong susundin, alin ang desisyon na hindi susundin. Mr. President, when we speak of morality and doing what is right, I'm of the firm belief that in our search for the truth, this does not in any way give us any right to violate the law. Sa paghahanap natin ng katotohanan, wala naman siguro tayong lisensyang lumabag sa batas at hindi sumunod sa utos ng Korte. Sa paghahanap ng katotohanan, ba't tayo tutulad sa kanila na walang pakundangan kung ilabag ang batas? Kung pag-uusapan po natin kung anong tama at mali, dapat dito tayo tumayo. Dito tayo naiiba dun sa iba. na walang pakundangan kung labagin ng batas, tama man o mali. Dahil kahit gaano kaganda ang ating motibo, wala tayong lisensyang lumabag sa anumang batas na tayo mismo ang pumasa. Bilang solusyon, Mr. President, Your Honors, ang akin pong naisip panukala ay una, to hold to task and hold to their word the defense and the respondent as well as their counsels in their promise to reveal in the course of the trial these bank deposits and bank accounts. Secondly, Mr. President, Your Honor, we have a Senate Bill number 107, which is contained in Committee Report number 2, the second committee report to be filed before plenary in this chamber. And I hope our colleagues in the House will support this too. It is a simple bill, Mr. President. It mandates that all public officials required to file SAL-N shall, together with their SAL-N, execute a waiver insofar as the secrecy of bank deposits are concerned. Perhaps this is the best time, this is the right time, to remind our colleagues both in the House and the Senate to pass this long overdue bill so that once and for all, we will be able to do this legally, and should this occur again, we would be empowered and would have the arms and the necessary mechanisms in order to exact the truth, not only from any respondent, but from our banks as well. As a final point, Mr. President, Your Honor, lahat tayo ayaw ng may daga sa loob ng bahay natin, kahit gaano man kalito kalaki yung dagang yun. Pero sa kagustuhan nating hulihin yung daga, wala naman siguro tayong lisensyang sunugin yung buong bahay. Idama yung ibang institusyon, idama yung ibang tao na wala naman pong kinalaman dito. Our vote